I love a good upcycle, but let's be real, everything's too short for me. These are on clearance, so I grabbed them, took the hem down, and ended up with this raw edge. So in this video, I'll show you how to turn that messy hem into a feature using one of my favorite fabrics, Batik, and a trick that works well on any jeans, long or short. It's easy, looks custom, and you'll never look at a raw edge the same way again. I'm using a bias tape style finish here because bias tape naturally has a little bit of stretch. It's cut on the bias, which gives you wiggle room. So if your strip ends up a little too long or too short, it still eases beautifully around the cuff. You usually see bias tape used for binding blankets or hemming curved skirts, but honestly, once you start using it, you'll see it everywhere. Bag trims, garment edges, craft projects, you name it. Normally, bias tape is about a quarter to a half inch wide. For this project, I'm going to make extra wide bias tape, a 2-inch final strip, so that it forms the entire cuff of my new pants. To make a bias tape, start with a square of fabric, mine's about half a yard. Cut your first strip at a 45-degree angle. That's the bias, the most stretchy direction of the fabric. Then take that triangle you just cut off, slide it down to the opposite side, and sew it back on to make a long parallelogram. In the next step, I'm going to show you how to turn that parallelogram into one continuous bias strip. And honestly, it's such a clever little sewing geometry trick. Once you've got your parallelogram cut, this is where I should have applied some interfacing to the back. I like using the stretch Pellon EasyKnit. Since bias tape is meant to stretch and ease around your curves, your backing needs to stretch too. If you use a non-stretch fusible or woven interfacing, it's just going to tear like mine did. Next, I'm going to sew my parallelogram together, basically attaching that triangle back to the square. And I should have put the interfacing on first, but I forgot. Also, you know what makes sewing machines work a whole lot better? Putting a needle in before you sew. So, pro tips. You know what's another pro tip? Use gray thread. I hate invisible thread. It's basically plastic, it doesn't feel nice, and honestly, it's not that invisible. I'd rather use a good all purpose thread, and when I'm working with a multicolored fabric like this batik, gray just disappears into everything. You can see it here on my finished piece. It blends beautifully and feels great. All right, I went ahead and ironed on that easy knit interfacing when you weren't looking. Now I'm figuring out how wide I want my cuff to be. I'm going for about 2 inches, so I'm cutting 5-inch strips to leave a little seam allowance. I've marked my chalk lines, and as you can see, I didn't get my parallelogram perfectly even. I had to trim a little bit off the top. Happens to the best of us. The next step is to line up those chalk lines, but shift them one slot off from each other and sew it into a tube. That offset is what turns it into one long continuous bias strip when you cut it apart. Okay, so now I've got my tube, and yes, I press that seam open. Next, find your chalk line and just start cutting. This is the fun part. It basically unravels the whole tube into one long spiral of bias tape. Then, of course, hit it with the iron again, because I'm obsessed with those crispy seams. At this point, though, the seam allowance was tiny, and I started to feel the burn on the tips of my fingers. And then I remembered I actually have a tool for that. These thermal thimbles are perfect for hot gluing and ironing. And if you're the kind of person who burns your hands on everything like I am, come to the store. I've got the perfect thing for you. Okay, so now I've ironed my bias tape in half and trimmed a length just about the size of my cuff with a little extra for seam allowance. Remember, this is giant bias tape, so if it ends up a little too small or a little too large, that's okay. That stretch is what makes it so forgiving. You can ease it right in there without a fight. And yes, I cut mine like a giant chevron, and I know there are quilters out there losing their minds right now because, yeah, that's not the right way to do it. But it was late and it worked and it fit together, so I did it. Technically, you're supposed to sew the joins on a diagonal so that the seams don't double up anywhere, but I was sleepy and I couldn't figure it out, so chevron it is. While I was sewing, I totally took advantage of the Husqvarna sensor system. Just tap your foot and it drops the needle and lifts the presser foot for those perfect pivots. And if you think that's cool, you should come try one in person. Did I mention that I sell sewing machines? Anyhow, a little ironing later, and I've got the perfect cuff to attach to my jeans. Okay, the rest is easy mode. I'm putting my new cuff inside the pant leg with the nice fold finish pointing up towards the waistband and pinning it in place. Because we cut it on the bias, it should ease right in. No fighting at all. One of mine fit perfectly. The other one needed a little bit of stretching, but that's why we cut it on the bias. Once it's pinned all the way around, sew along the bottom edge using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I wanted to keep as much of that cuff showing as possible. However, if you're trying to shorten your pants, you're going to trim your pant legs first and then add the cuff. So all the way around, flip it out and give it one more press. Then fold the cuff over and press again because you know I can't resist a nice crisp edge. Okay, so now I've got two beautiful cuffs on the edges of my pants and they still need to stay up. I could use hem tape and press it into that seam and it would look great. But you know me, I'm obsessed with fun decorative stitches, so of course that's what I'm going to do. And for that, I'm using my very favorite color of embroidery thread. Some of you already know what it is, so go ahead and drop it in the comments and let everyone know that you're one of the cool kids. I just chose one of the heritage quilt stitches and look how fantastic it turned out. I love them. So, whether your pants are too long, too short, too boring, or you just needed an excuse to play with giant bias tape, I hope you give this project a try. These jeans turned out adorable, and I love the splash of color at the bottom. I do think they could use a little more tailoring over the hips, though, so drop a comment if that's something that you'd like to learn in a future video. And I'll see y'all next time. If you're curious for more, check out one of these other videos or come see me in the store for a class. I promise, I'm even more fun in person.